In the forgotten town of Dust Creek, the heat wasn't the only thing that felt heavy. In the center of the town square stood a reinforced iron wagon, its bars thick and rusted. Inside sat a woman who had become the town's greatest fear and its cruelest curiosity. They called her the Giant Widow. She stood over 6.5 feet tall, a mountain of a woman with eyes that held 1,000 miles of unspoken grief. The world saw a monster, a freak of nature tied to her late husband's deaths. But one man, a solitary soul from the high peaks, saw something else. He saw a woman who had been broken by the world but refused to fall. This is a story of a bargain made in the dust, a love that reached above the clouds, and a survival that defied every expectation.
Welcome to Rescued by the Ridge. We tell the stories of the brave souls who sought a new life in the wild. If you believe in redemption and the power of the human spirit, please subscribe and join our community. Your support helps us keep these forgotten tales alive.
The air in Dust Creek tasted like grit and old secrets. It was a town where the sun bleached the boards of the general store and the wind never seemed to stop its lonely whistling. On this particular afternoon, the square was crowded. Folks had traveled from 3 counties over, not for supplies, but to gape at the spectacle in the iron cage. Her name was Willa. She sat on a low wooden bench inside the wagon, her knees tucked toward her chest to fit the space. Even sitting, she was imposing. Her shoulders were broad, her hands were calloused, and her height was something the local women whispered about with a mix of envy and terror. To the people of Dust Creek, a woman was supposed to be small and fragile. Willa was neither. She had been brought here by a man named Mr. Gantry, a silver-tongued opportunist who had purchased her debt. You see, in the mid-1800s, the law was rarely on the side of a grieving woman. When Willa's husband passed away, he left behind a mountain of gambling debts and failed contracts. Under the laws of the time, Willa didn't just inherit his grief, she inherited his ruin. Gantry had stepped in, claiming her as collateral, turning her extraordinary size into a traveling sideshow to recoup his coins. The crowd jeered. Someone tossed a piece of rotted fruit toward the bars. Willa didn't flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, her spirit tucked away in a place they couldn't reach. Then the crowd parted. A man walked through the heat haze. He didn't wear the fine silks of the merchants or the dirty rags of the miners. He wore buckskin and heavy boots, and he smelled of pine resin and cold mountain air. His name was Thaddeus. He was a homesteader from the High Ridge, a place where the winters lasted 6 months and the work was enough to break 3 men. Thaddeus didn't join in the laughter. He stopped in front of the cage and looked at Willa. He didn't see a giantess. He saw the way she held her head with a dignity that the iron bars couldn't touch. He looked at Gantry, who was busy shouting to the crowd about the strongest woman in the territories. Thaddeus reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a small, weathered leather pouch. The sound of clinking gold silenced the jeering crowd. "How much for the debt, Gantry?" Thaddeus asked, his voice like grinding stones. "I'm not buying a ticket. I'm buying the paper." Gantry's eyes lit up with greed, but the townspeople went silent. They looked at the massive woman, then at the rugged man, and a cold shiver ran through the square. Thaddeus wasn't looking for a worker. He was looking for something else entirely.
The silence in the square was so thick you could hear the snap of the sun-dried banners in the wind. Mr. Gantry, a man who lived by the shimmer of a coin, weighed the leather pouch in his palm. He looked at Thaddeus, then back at the woman in the cage. A slow, crooked grin spread across his face. He knew he had the advantage. To him, Willa wasn't a person. She was an asset, a curiosity that drew crowds and filled his pockets. "This woman has years of labor left on her husband's notes," Gantry said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "She's got the strength of a team of oxen. You want to clear her name, mountain man? It'll cost you every bit of what's in that bag and then some." Thaddeus didn't blink. He knew the cost of things. Up on the ridge, you learned that nothing worth having came cheap. He reached into his vest and pulled out a silver watch, his only heirloom, and laid it on top of the gold. It was a heavy price. It was his entire season's worth of trapping and trading, everything he had saved to survive the coming winter. "The paper," Thaddeus repeated, his voice low and steady, "and the key." Gantry snatched the watch in the bag. He fumbled through his vest, producing a crumpled legal document and a heavy iron key. With a mocking bow, he handed them over. The crowd leaned in, breathless. They expected a show. They expected Thaddeus to put a collar on her or command her to haul his wagon like a beast of burden. Thaddeus ignored them. He stepped up to the cage. The iron lock groaned as he turned the key. The heavy door swung open with a screech that echoed off the storefronts. He held out the debt paper toward Willa. "This belongs to you now. The law says your debt is satisfied. You are a free woman, Willa. You can walk out of that cage and never look back." Willa finally raised her eyes. Up close, Thaddeus realized just how large she truly was. As she stood, the wagon groaned under her weight. She rose slowly, unfolding herself like a great blue heron taking flight. When she stepped onto the dusty ground, she towered over every man in the square. The townspeople shrank back, their jeers turning into a fearful hush. They were waiting for her to lash out, to seek revenge for the fruit they had thrown. But Willa didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Thaddeus. She looked at his empty hands and his honest eyes. For the first time in years, she wasn't being stared at like a prize or a problem. She was being seen. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the dirt. Willa took a tentative step, her legs shaky from weeks of confinement. She clutched the shawl Thaddeus had given her, wrapping it around her broad shoulders. She was free, yes, but in the Old West, freedom for a woman with no money and no kin was often just a different kind of sentence. Thaddeus watched her, his expression unreadable. He knew the road ahead was steep, and he knew the town was already whispering. He turned toward the trail leading out of town, but he didn't walk away. He waited.
The dust of the town square began to settle as the shadows grew long and purple against the canyon walls. Thaddeus led Willa toward the quiet edge of town, near a weathered livery stable where his pack mules were tied. The noise of the crowd faded, replaced by the soft lowing of cattle and the rhythmic clinking of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance. Willa walked with a slow, cautious gait, her head bowed. Now that the iron bars were gone, the weight of the world felt even heavier. She clutched the debt paper in her hand, the ink-stained proof that she was no longer a piece of property, but her heart was far from light. She knew how the world worked. A woman of her size, with no family and no home, was a target for more than just mockery. Thaddeus stopped by a watering trough and turned to face her. Up close, away from the prying eyes of the town, the height difference was striking, but Thaddeus didn't crane his neck or stumble back. He stood his ground like an old cedar tree. "I imagine you're wondering why I'd trade a season's wages for a stranger's freedom," Thaddeus began, his voice softening. Willa found her voice, though it was raspy from disuse. "I have nothing to give you, sir. If you're looking for a servant, I've got the strength, but my spirit is tired." Thaddeus shook his head. "I don't want a servant, Willa, and I didn't pull you out of that cage to put you in another one." He paused, looking toward the jagged peaks of the high ridge that loomed over the horizon.
My homestead is 5 days' ride from here. It's a lonely place. The soil is rich, but the timber is heavy, and the winters are cruel. I built a cabin meant for 2, but I've been living in it alone for 3 years." He looked her straight in the eye. "I'm a plain-spoken man. I need a partner. Not just someone to help with the harvest or the hauling, but someone to share the fire with. I'm offering you my name, a roof over your head, and a place where no one will ever put you behind bars again." Willa stared at him, stunned. In the mid-19th century, marriages of convenience were common on the frontier. They were practical unions, born of necessity, where survival mattered more than sentiment. Yet there was a kindness in his offer that went beyond practicality. He wasn't asking her to be a beast of burden. He was asking her to be a bride. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know you stood tall when they tried to make you small. That's enough for me." Willa looked at her large, scarred hands, then back at the mountain man. The ridge was a dangerous place, but the world down here had been nothing but a cage. She took a deep breath, the scent of pine on his coat promising a life she never thought possible. "I'll go with you," she said firmly.
The journey started before the sun had even kissed the horizon. Thaddeus led the way, his 2 pack mules laden with salt, seed, and the few iron tools he'd traded for. Willa followed behind him, her stride long and steady. As they left the flat, dusty basins of the lowlands, the air began to change. It grew thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. The trail to the high ridge wasn't a road. It was a narrow ribbon of rock that hugged the mountainside. Traveling in the Old West required more than just grit. It required a deep understanding of the land. For every mile they climbed, the temperature dropped, and the vegetation shifted from scrub brush to towering ponderosa pines. Thaddeus kept a watchful eye on the sky, knowing that a mountain storm could turn a dry creek bed into a raging river in a matter of minutes. By the second afternoon, they reached a section of the trail known as the Devil's Elbow. A recent rockfall had choked the path with heavy shale and mud. Thaddeus halted the mules, his face etched with concern. The lead mule's wagon wheel had slipped into a deep, muddy rut hidden beneath the debris. Thaddeus dismounted and put his shoulder to the frame, his muscles straining until his face turned a deep crimson. The wagon wouldn't budge. "We'll have to unload the grain," Thaddeus grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "If we don't get this wheel out before the ground settles, we'll lose the axle." Willa stepped forward. She didn't wait for an invitation. She positioned herself at the rear of the wagon, her boots digging into the loose soil for leverage. She didn't just push, she lifted. Thaddeus watched in silent awe as the heavy wooden frame rose, the mud groaning as it released its grip. With one powerful heave, she shifted the weight back onto solid rock. She stood back, smoothing her apron, her breathing only slightly hurried. Thaddeus looked at the wagon, then at her. In the towns below, her strength was seen as a freakish curiosity. But out here, where the mountain didn't care about your gender or your grace, her strength was a blessing. It was a tool for survival, as necessary as a sharp axe or a warm fire. "I reckon you're stronger than the ox, Willa," Thaddeus said softly. There was no mockery in his voice, only a newfound respect. Willa felt a strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "My father always said the mountains were built for the big," Willa replied. Thaddeus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his beard. He realized then that he hadn't just brought home a wife. He had found the only person capable of truly taming the ridge by his side. As the sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the peaks, the sky turned a bruised purple. The temperature plummeted, a reminder that on the ridge, the sun is the only thing standing between a man and a bone-deep chill.
Thaddeus found a sheltered overhang of granite to make camp. While he tended to the mules, Willa gathered fallen branches, her long arms reaching high into the scrub oaks to pull down dry wood that others would have needed a ladder to reach. Soon a modest fire crackled between them. The smell of parched corn and dried venison filled the small circle of light, but the silence between the two was heavier than the darkness beyond. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, two strangers bound by a piece of paper and a long walk uphill. "You speak of your father," Thaddeus said, breaking the quiet. He was sharpening a small skinning knife, the rhythmic witch of the stone providing a heartbeat to the evening. "Was he a big man, too?" Willa looked into the embers. "He was a blacksmith back east. He always told me that my size was a gift from the earth, meant for heavy lifting and long miles. But when he died, the world started looking at me differently. They didn't see a helper anymore. They saw a burden. My husband, he saw a way to settle his debts. He'd take bets at the taverns on how much I could carry until there was nothing left of me but the weight." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "When he passed, I thought the cage was my final home. I thought I'd be a spectacle until my bones grew old." Thaddeus stopped sharpening his knife. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his weary eyes. "People in the valley, they fear what they can't measure, Willa. They like things small so they can feel big. But up here, the mountain doesn't care about your height or your husband's debts. It only cares if you've got the heart to wake up and face the wind." He reached into his pack and pulled out a heavy wool blanket, tossing it gently across the fire to her. "I came to the ridge because I didn't fit their mold either. I'm a man of few words and a restless soul. Down there, they call that lonely. Up here, it's just called peace." Willa caught the blanket, the warmth of the wool a physical comfort against the biting air. For the first time, the giant widow felt the title slipping away. In the shadows of the fire, she wasn't a widow, and she wasn't a giant. She was just a woman sitting with a man who understood that being different didn't mean being broken.
The peace of the campfire was shattered before dawn by a sound like a distant freight train. It wasn't thunder, but the low, guttural roar of the wind weaving through the high mountain passes. On the ridge, weather is not a mere inconvenience, it is a physical force. A mountain gale can strip the needles from a pine tree and turn a clear trail into a death trap of sliding shale. As they began their final ascent, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. Thaddeus squinted into the gale, his hand firmly on the lead mule's bridle. "We need to reach the timberline," he shouted over the howling wind. "If we're caught on the exposed face when the sleet starts, the mules will spook and slide." In the high country, the timberline is the elevation where trees struggled to grow due to the harsh climate. It's a place of transition, and today it was their only hope for shelter. But nature had other plans. A massive gust channeled through the narrow canyon slammed into the side of the lead mule. The animal panicked, braying in terror as its hooves skittered on the icy rock. Thaddeus lunged to steady the pack, but his boot slipped on a patch of black ice. He went down hard, his leg pinned beneath the heavy wooden frame of the supply pack. The mule continued to thrash, its weight threatening to pull both Thaddeus and the supplies over the crumbling edge of the cliff. In the Old West, a broken leg on a mountain trail was often a death sentence. Thaddeus's face paled as he realized he was trapped. Willa didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She moved with a frightening, focused grace. She stepped into the chaos, her massive frame acting as a windbreak. She grabbed the mule's bridle with one hand, her grip like iron, forcing the animal's head down to calm it. With her other hand, she reached under the heavy pack frame.
Her muscles bunched beneath her wool dress. With a low, primal groan of effort, she lifted the entire weight of the loaded animal in the supply frame, just enough for Thaddeus to roll free. She held the weight for several seconds, a feat of strength that seemed impossible for any human, until Thaddeus was clear of the ledge. As she lowered the load, the wind died down for a brief, haunting second. Thaddeus sat on the cold stone, gasping for air, looking up at the woman who had just defied the mountain itself. He had bought her to help him survive the ridge, but he realized now that without her, the ridge would have already claimed him. "You're hurt," Willa said, her voice steady despite the storm. She knelt beside him, her large hands surprisingly gentle as she checked his injury. "Just a bruise and a bruised pride," Thaddeus managed to say, leaning on her shoulder to rise. For the first time, he didn't just see her strength as a tool, he saw it as his salvation.
By the time the clouds finally parted, the air had grown still and bitingly cold. They turned a final corner around a massive limestone crag, and there it was, the high ridge. It was a vast, wind-swept plateau that felt like the roof of the world. In the center of a clearing stood a small cabin, its logs silvered by the sun, and its stone chimney leaning slightly to the west. To Thaddeus, it was a sanctuary. To Willa, standing at her full height against the open sky, it looked like a ruin. The porch steps were rotting, the garden was a tangle of wild brambles, and a section of the roof had been shingled with nothing but hope and old cedar bark. This was the reality of the American frontier. It was a place where home was a constant battle against decay. "It isn't much," Thaddeus admitted, leaning heavily on a walking stick he'd fashioned from a pine branch. "I spent so much time trapping and trading to pay off the land that I let the house slip. I figured as long as it kept the snow off my head, it was enough." Willa stepped onto the porch. The floorboards groaned, but they held. She reached up and touched the eaves of the roof. Most men would have needed a ladder just to inspect the damage, but Willa could lay her palms flat against the overhang while standing on the ground. She looked at the gaps in the chinking, the mud and straw mixture used to seal the logs against the wind. "The bones are good," Willa said, her voice echoing in the quiet clearing. "But a house is like a person, Thaddeus. If you don't tend to it, the cold finds a way inside." They didn't waste a moment. For the next 3 days, the ridge was filled with the sounds of labor. This was the educational reality of mountain life. Survival depended on winterizing. They worked in a rhythmic partnership. Thaddeus, though limping, mixed the new chinking, while Willa used her immense reach to pack it into the high crevices that had been neglected for years. She cleared the brambles with a few powerful swings of a scythe, uncovering a garden plot that had been swallowed by the wild. Her strength made the work move 3 times faster than Thaddeus had ever managed alone. As the sun set on their 3rd day at the homestead, the cabin looked different. It looked sturdy. It looked defiant. That evening, as they sat on the repaired porch, Thaddeus looked at the woman beside him. She was covered in dust and mud, her hair escaping its pins, but she looked more beautiful to him than any woman in the valley. She wasn't a giantess here. She was the very pillar that was holding his world together.
The peace of the high ridge was a rare commodity, usually broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of the pines. But a week after their arrival, the sound of wagon wheels signaled company. In the Old West, a neighbor wasn't just a person living nearby. They were often the only lifeline in an emergency. The closest neighbors were the Millers, a family living 3 miles downslope who had come up to trade a crate of chickens for Thaddeus's mountain honey. As the Miller family pulled their wagon into the clearing, the air shifted. Silas Miller and his wife Sarah jumped down, their smiles ready, until they saw Willa standing by the well. Willa had been hauling 2 massive wooden buckets of water, one in each hand, moving with a fluid power that made the heavy loads look like feathers. The Millers froze. Sarah Miller instinctively pulled her young daughter behind her skirts, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and superstition.
In those days, isolated communities were often wary of anything or anyone that defied the natural order. To them, a woman of Willa's stature wasn't just unusual, she was a bad omen. "Lord have mercy, Thaddeus," Silas stammered, his hand gripping the seat of his wagon. "We heard rumors in town about a creature in a cage. We didn't reckon you'd be the one to bring it to the ridge." The word creature hit Willa harder than any stone. She set the buckets down, the water sloshing over the rims. She began to shrink into herself, her shoulders hunching, trying to make herself smaller to fit their narrow expectations. Thaddeus stepped forward, his limp barely noticeable now. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't reach for a tool. He simply stood between the Millers and his wife. "Silas," Thaddeus said, his voice cold and steady as a mountain stream, "this is Willa. She is my wife. And on this ridge, we don't use words like creature. We use words like neighbor and family." He turned and looked at Willa, beckoning her forward. "Willa saved my life on the trail. She's the reason this cabin still stands, and she's the reason there's a fire in that hearth. If you've come to trade, you trade with both of us. But if you've come to judge, then you can turn that wagon around right now." Sarah Miller looked at the neatly chinked logs of the cabin and the cleared garden. She saw the dignity in Willa's eyes, a reflection of the same loneliness Sarah herself had felt when she first moved to the wilderness. Slowly, Sarah stepped out from behind the wagon. I apologize, ma'am," her voice softening. "The mountain makes us all a bit jumpy. It's a pleasure to meet you." Willa stood tall then. She didn't have to hide. For the first time, she wasn't being defended by a cage. She was being defended by a man who saw her as his equal.
The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered a few days later by a sound that made Willa's blood turn to ice. It was the rhythmic, arrogant jingle of silver-mounted harness bells. A fancy buckboard wagon, entirely out of place on the rugged mountain trails, rattled into the clearing. Sitting atop the bench, draped in a coat of fine wool that looked absurd against the raw timber of the ridge, was Mr. Gantry. He wasn't alone. He had brought 2 hired hands from the town, men with hard faces, who leaned against the wagon frame with a practiced, intimidating silence. Gantry climbed down, his polished boots stepping daintily over the mud Willa had worked so hard to clear. "I'm afraid there's been a legal misunderstanding, Thaddeus," Gantry called out, his voice oily and loud. He held up a scrolled parchment. "I've been reviewing the late husband's ledgers. It seems I didn't have the authority to sell the full term of the debt. There was a secondary lien, a labor clause, that requires the widow to serve out the remainder of the year in my employ." It was a lie, a classic shyster tactic, often used in the lawless fringes of the territories to reclaim valuable assets. Gantry had seen how healthy and strong Willa looked when she left town, and he realized he'd lost a golden goose. Willa stepped off the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old fear, the feeling of the iron bars closing in, threatened to swallow her. She looked at the 2 men Gantry had brought, their presence a silent threat of force. In the Old West, debt collection was often just a polite word for kidnapping. Thaddeus stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. He didn't have a rifle in his hand, but he held something much more powerful in the eyes of the law, the original bill of sale and his own leather-bound ledger. "The ridge operates on a different set of rules than your dusty town, Gantry," Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I've studied the Homestead Act and the territorial statutes. A debt satisfied in full, witnessed by the town clerk, cannot be reopened without a circuit judge, and the nearest judge is a 10-day ride from here." Thaddeus walked right up to Gantry, standing his ground. You're trespassing on a federal claim. That's a serious charge." But it was Willa who finished it. She walked forward, her shadow falling over Gantry like an eclipse. She didn't raise a hand. She simply stood to her full, magnificent height, looking down at the man who had kept her in a cage. "I am not a ledger entry anymore, Mr. Gantry," she said, her voice vibrating with a strength that shook the air. "I am a wife, a partner, and a free woman of the Ridge. If you want your labor, you can try to take it from the mountain itself, but you won't take it from me." Gantry looked at the towering woman, then at the immovable man beside her, and finally at the vast, uncaring wilderness surrounding them. He realized that out here, his papers and his city manners meant nothing. With a cursed mutter, he signaled his men back to the wagon. The ghost of her past vanished in a cloud of dust, leaving the Ridge silent once more.
The dust from Gantry's wagon had long since settled, and the high ridge returned to its natural rhythm. The air grew crisp with the coming of late autumn, turning the aspen leaves into shimmering coins of gold. For the first time in her life, Willa didn't watch the changing seasons with dread. In the past, winter meant shivering in a drafty barn or the cramped corners of a cage. Now it meant the scent of drying herbs hanging from the rafters and the sturdy warmth of a home she had helped rebuild. One evening, as the first few flakes of scout snow began to drift from the heavens, Thaddeus sat by the hearth. He was working with a small piece of mountain mahogany, a wood known for being as hard as iron but capable of a high polish. Willa sat across from him, mending a heavy wool coat. The silence between them was no longer the awkward quiet of two strangers. It was the comfortable peace of a shared life. Thaddeus cleared his throat and set down his carving knife. He stood and walked over to where Willa sat, her large frame bathed in the soft orange glow of the fire. "Willa," he said softly, "when I brought you up here, I told you it was for survival. I told you I needed a partner for the work. And you've done more than your share. You saved my life, and you saved this house." He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He placed the small object he had been carving into her hand. It was a simple, polished ring, smooth and dark. "But the truth is," he continued, "the Ridge doesn't feel lonely anymore because of you. I didn't just buy a debt that day in Dust Creek. I found the other half of my soul. I'm asking you now, not because of a paper or a bargain, but because I love you. Will you truly be my wife, in heart and in spirit, as long as the mountain stands?" Willa looked at the ring, then up at the man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world saw only a spectacle. Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't hide them. She stood up, her large frame bathed in the soft orange glow of the fire. "Yes, Thaddeus," she whispered, her voice steady and full of hope, "as long as the mountain stands." They stood together by the window, watching the snow blanket the peaks. They were two outcasts who had found a kingdom in the clouds. In the harsh beauty of the Old West, they had discovered the greatest survival tool of all, a love that saw past the exterior to the strength of the heart within.
Thank you for joining us on the High Ridge today. Willa and Thaddeus's journey reminds us that no matter how the world tries to cage us or define us by our past, we all have the power to write a new story of redemption. If this tale touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the Old West. What did you think of Willa's courage? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts on these stories of survival. If you want to hear more tales of love and grit, be sure to check out our Mountain Legends playlist on the screen now. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and may your own path lead you to peace. Safe travels, friends.